This is not a government. This is not a administration. This is an authoritarian regime. They only take their marching orders from one person, Donald Trump, who is the dictator in chief. And you can see that by the way that the Republican Congress absolved itself from all of its own duties to solely rubber stamp what Trump wants.
Hi, I'm Fergus Macphee, and welcome to the Trump Report on Times Radio. A reminder, you can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on our YouTube channel, and you can also listen and follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Joining me today on the show is former US Naval Intelligence Officer Malcolm Nance. Malcolm, we always enjoy talking to you. How are you today?
Well, I'm fine. I hope this conversation about the state of America changes things, but I'm not optimistic about that.
We'll do our best, I'm sure, and we will get straight into it. And today we want to start talking about the president and a third term in office. Now, this is something that's been swirling away in the background for the last few months or so, but it's been reunited over this last week because former Trump strategist Steve Bannon he said in an interview with the Times that there has been a plan in place for Trump to run in 2028. This is, of course, barred by the US Constitution. Now, I want to get into what the president himself has said in just a few moments, but should we be taking this and what Steve Bannon says at all seriously?
Well, should you be taking it seriously? Yes, because let's be quite honest. And as someone who is a son of Philadelphia, the place where America was founded, where our guiding principles were written down, where our freedom from England's King George III was announced, where a good piece of the Constitution was formulated and written before it was ratified in New York. I find this highly, highly offensive, very offensive. But Steve Bannon is a bugaboo that exists within the Trump world to push the extremities of how can I put it, of normal thought out to where the Overton window goes literally out the window, crashes down at the street. So he does not care about the norms. Then again, this is a man who was a student of the Russian or Putin's philosopher Alexander Dugin, who once called himself a Leninist in the way that he saw the government should be run. So he's a totalitarian. He's an authoritarian dictator supporter who thinks that and his cult of personality can do no wrong. Therefore, the principal guidelines, the founding guidelines and operating system of America, which after Franklin Delano Roosevelt changed the Constitution so that a populist president couldn't have more than two terms, it's written in stone. But then again, Trump and Bannon have both advocated to break the Constitution on its own. Trump at one point said we should even be prepared to ignore it if it clashes with his ideas. So when they say, "Yeah, we're going to talk about Trump running for a third term," Trump in his last when he was out of power kept um, supposing and amusing aloud that because to him the 2020 election in which he lost by 7 million votes was stolen from him, therefore he should have a free do-over and that the Constitution shouldn't apply to him. I think as these burgeoning wannabe totalitarians, they're planning on it and they're going to do it. The question is, will America allow it? Are they too busy focused on their fantasy football leagues, or is this going to be yet another thing that causes America to move to its own new, maybe second American Revolution?
I guess the question is, are they within the actual administration planning it, though? Because I guess why should we listen to what Steve Bannon has to say? He doesn't work for the administration. He hasn't for some time. I'm sure that he and other figures on the right might want this to happen. Doesn't necessarily mean it will happen.
This is not a government. This is not a administration. This is an authoritarian regime. They only take their marching orders from one person, Donald Trump, who is the dictator in chief. And you can see that by the way that the Republican Congress absolved itself from all of its own duties to solely rubber stamp what Trump wants. This is a North Korean or Russian state style Duma who will sit and politely clap louder and louder for the fearless leader. Out of fear that they will be cut out of gaining some of the money that Trump is getting from the billionaires who are backing them. By the way, Benito Mussolini defined this as a dictatorship of the corporate and authoritarian right, which he called il fascisti, right? The fascist. And that's what this is. This is a fascist regime that views themselves as sole arbiters of what goes on in terms of government, in terms of commerce, and in terms of rights. And that's where, when Steve Bannon makes a comment like this has been discussed amongst all of his closest acolytes. And all they're waiting for is the fearless leader to tell them that they need to make this happen.
Okay, you describe it as a regime, and sort of everyone does what one person says, Donald Trump. Well, if we go back to the comments the president made about this yesterday on board Air Force One, he didn't rule it out. He did say that he would love to do it, but hasn't really thought about it in sort of typical Donald Trump fashion. But he did, however, rule out the possibility of running as VP in 2028, which has been suggested by some as a way to sort of circumvent the Constitution. I'll just read what he said. Said, I think people wouldn't like that. It's too cute. It wouldn't be right. Now, I don't know about you. I think what he said there is quite telling because it sounds like he's aware of sort of the plans that people have been talking about and he doesn't want to take people for fools.
Hmm. Look, every week I do a podcast on Substack with Michael Cohen, his former lawyer who worked for him for 13 years, every day, day in and day out. This was his wartime legal consigliere, right? He knows Donald Trump intimately. And then Lev Parnas, who worked for him for 3 years, who was his international consigliere, so to speak. They are both adamant in the way that Trump speaks is a deliberate style that he learned from Roy Cohen in the New York Mafia, which is never say what you mean. Always imply what you really want people to know, and then let everyone else talk it up. And you seem like the person who has got to ultimately give in to the populism. That is a ludicrous statement. Donald Trump, okay, let's just stipulate a few things. And I know people say Malcolm Nance is a critic. Malcolm Nance is an intelligence professional. And if this were Burundi or Mali, I would be making the exact same analyses. Donald Trump is a pathological liar. He is also the single most documented liar in American history, documented, where you could prove everything out of his mouth was a lie. So why would we give him any credibility when he says, "Oh, I've never heard about this. This is the first thing." The comment about Trump being vice president is the Putin Medvedev model of how they would switch roles for a couple of years to have the legal basis of coming back in as president or vice president. He's never going to do that. This man wants to be a dictator. He is now moving America to being its first truly authoritarian leader. And the people who are there are just saying these things to put smoke into the clouds. Now, our problem in the United States is quite simply this. The Supreme Court has decided that they're just going to become a rubber stamp for Donald Trump. I had a scholar of constitutional law on my podcast, um, Dahlia Lithwick, who said for the first time in American government, you can truly see where the Supreme Court will solely rule for him. And that should a Democratic president come in 2028, they will overturn all of their previous precedent to tie the hands of the next president of the United States. John Roberts has completely sullied the reputation of the U.S. Supreme Court by giving Donald Trump strictly what Donald Trump wants, by overturning all of the laws and precedents that for 250 years had guided him. So when you have this kind of legal cover, you'll do anything you want.
I mean, I guess we'll find out, I think maybe this month or in December, that decision on the tariffs. I guess it doesn't sound like you're particularly hopeful on that.
No, they've already hinted that the president can do anything he wants. They've given him exclusive executive powers that essentially turned Donald Trump into what George Washington himself argued against when he was president and they wanted him to run for a third term, that the president should not be king and should not be an authoritarian leader with unlimited, unchecked powers. We now have a government with no checks. The attorney general and the Justice Department has turned into his private prosecution's office solely on his whim and his say so. The FBI has turned into a machine that is investigating only his enemies. This is every mark of an authoritarian leader. And by using the Supreme Court as cover, they've completely abdicated what it means to be part of American jurisprudence. Then again, I always remind people that if you watch the movie Judgment at Nuremberg with Spencer Tracy, they are not prosecuting Nazis who executed millions of people. They are prosecuting the prosecutor in general and the head of the German Supreme Court for authorizing laws that made Anne Frank a criminal by hiding from the Gestapo, and the woman that turned her in and sent her to her death a lawful citizen. And that's what's happening in the United States. The laws are being changed to make things that were previously lawful unlawful, and people who are living by the law criminals just by their mere presence of coming through a U.S. border, for example.
And if you don't think his words take any weight around the vice president sort of conversation, is that what you think will happen in 2028? They will change the law.
Oh, not at all. Donald Trump is such a malignant, insane, malignant narcissist that he would his niece,
Mm.
right, Mary Trump, who has her PhD in psychology, says that the narcissistic damage that he suffered by Joe Biden and Barack Obama and others by working within the laws, by having legal elections, by having to face the will of the American people was too much for him, to the point where every word out of his mouth is a lie, and he understands there's a block of people he can mobilize that if
Mm.
he had to, he could get
Mm.
them to kill. And although Michael Cohen and both Lev Parnas say that that's not the way he operates, he'll have someone like Stephen Miller order
Mm.
people to kill, but he will mafia don this the way he always does, right? Gives a hint of who wants to get rid of the meddlesome priest. And then suddenly, when the meddlesome priest is gone, he'll say, oh my God, that's horrible. So, no, you can give no credibility to Donald Trump on any of these things. And I find this fascinating.
Just one more question on this. What would you say to, maybe there might be some people watching and listening out there who might say, look, as we started, this has originally come in this context from Steve Bannon. Until we hear Donald Trump say the words, I'm going to run in 2028 and starts putting that in action, some people might say that all this talk is a little alarmist.
They are moving quickly to turn America into a one party state. Donald Trump himself said that he is weaponizing the Justice Department to turn off and designate all funding for the Democratic Party through groups like Act Blue as supporting terrorism. Now, I'm a counterterrorism expert. I spent my entire 40 years hunting down terrorists and their funding around the world. This is just moving to a one party system. As I called it in my 2018 book, The Plot to Destroy Democracy, which was really about Russia's efforts to support the Trump administration and right wing extremist governments in Europe, they are turning the United States into what I call a constitutional autocracy, in which the Constitution is afforded to those who are in the MAGA world, but it's a fig leaf and taken away from all the others. And that's where I can make very clear analogies.
Let's move on slightly to something that I believe you've talked about on the show, I think even with me before, and that is Venezuela. Because last week, the US sent the world's largest warship, the USS Gerald R. Ford, on its way to the Caribbean and closer towards Venezuela. And a further destroyer, the USS Gravely, arrived in Trinidad and Tobago on Sunday. Now, we know over the last sort of few weeks and months, the US has carried out a handful of strikes on vessels, which it says is part of a war on drug trafficking. What's behind this new movement of warships and what seems to be something of an escalation?
Yeah, when we talked about this last time, we talked about I had predicted, I had said that there had to have been an intelligence finding by the president, which is a secret memorandum where he is declaring war on Venezuela. And they're going to do it in a series of steps. One, you immediately mobilize clandestine forces, right? Yeah, whether that's the Central Intelligence Agency or Joint Special Operations Command, to move into that area to start shaping the intelligence on the battlefield. They had been flying RC 135 special reconnaissance aircraft down there for years. So they have a good baseline of what the military, the armed forces of Venezuela look like. And then we started this flotilla of ships in late August, 8 warships that started to position themselves off of Venezuela. However, I don't believe these strikes on these small boats are being carried out by the US Navy. I believe they're being carried out by the CIA because they would come within the findings where the president personally designated Venezuela an overseas foreign terrorist organization without any real basis of that. There have been no terrorist attacks by the United States of Venezuela. He has unilaterally and without any precedence declared that drug dealers or drugs transshipping transshippers or smugglers are terrorists and are subject to extra legal, extrajudicial execution. Now, we have Americans who say, well, Barack Obama did that. He killed American citizens who were overseas. All of them had been found as members of very well known terrorist groups that had carried out murderous attacks against the United States, Al Qaeda and the Islamic State. And as they went overseas to join a foreign terrorist group, they had their citizenship removed, including when both Anwar al-Awlaki and his son were carrying weapons in a vehicle in which the CIA had a spy, the Danish had a spy, where they were en route to execute a terrorist attack or execute attack that would be carried out by others against the United States. Those were lawful legal strikes. We are just attacking boats that we think are carrying what we would presume are drugs. We have been intercepting these vessels for decades down there, seizing the vessels, identifying drugs, turning over the drug dealers to whoever's country waters that they were transiting from or transiting to. This is almost common knowledge. The dispatch of the USS Iwo Jima with 2,500 Marines, which right now is sitting in Charlotte Amelie Harbor, and the USS Gerald Ford, which, by the way, is off of Naples, Italy. It's going to take 2.5 to 3 weeks for the Ford to get to the Caribbean. And they've just completed a combat deployment. So all of these assets are actually weakening the United States around the world to go off of Venezuela. When you put a flat top like the Ford and an amphibious warfare group like the Iwo Jima, you are planning something more than just a demonstration of force. You're planning potentially regime change. And it apparently the Venezuelans have got a whiff of that. They're claiming that the USS Gravely, which is an Arleigh Burke destroyer that's in Trinidad for a port visit, was supposed to be attacked by a quote unquote Venezuelan force that would have had a USS Maine attack as happened in Havana Harbor in 1892, if I'm not mistaken. It started the Spanish-American War. The problem is with Donald Trump's administration, that becomes believable. It is not in Venezuela's interest to have anything happen down there, and nor China's, nor Iran's, nor Russia's, all of whom back Venezuela.
And it's worth saying that undoubtedly drugs perhaps do pass through Venezuela, but most of the fentanyl in America is produced in Mexico, and cocaine is mainly Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. So you kind of touched on it a little bit there. Is this really about drugs?
Not at all. Okay, first off, some facts that you just laid out are important to reiterate. Number one, 99% of fentanyl to the United States comes as precursors from China to Mexico. From Mexico into the United States, where it's synthesized into fentanyl.
Mm.
Fentanyl does not come from the Caribbean. Cocaine does not come from Venezuela. This is a precursor to Donald Trump trying to take Venezuela's large oil reserves, and it's not going to work.
Malcolm Nance, thank you so much for joining us on the Trump Report.
My pleasure.